Hello learners, welcome to this session on the course BMDG 171, Disability, Society and Culture. In today's session, we shall be discussing Block 4 of this course, which is titled Disability and Socio-Economic Realities. The block comprises of 3 units, Unit 12, Disability and its Intersections, Unit 13, Access to Education and Health, and Unit 14, Political and Economic Exclusion and Opportunities. So basically the block is looking at the intersections of disability with gender, caste, class and other markers of identity and how these affect the lives of persons with disabilities. It will also discuss how people with disabilities are included and excluded in the education, health, economic and political systems, and we will also talk about the various strategies through which these issues can be resolved and persons with disabilities can be included in all aspects of society. So let's begin by talking about Unit 12, titled Disability and its Intersections. Now, the term intersection or intersectionality basically refers to the way in which multiple kinds of identities come together to determine an individual's life experiences. And the term intersectionality or intersectional theory was coined in 1989 by the American civil rights advocate and scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. Now, Crenshaw coined this in the context of gender. So, for instance, when we look at women, we cannot speak about women as one, homogeneous category. Women who come from poor socioeconomic strata, women who come from different races, different castes, all have different experiences. Yes, of course, the common experience is that they are all women and therefore they suffer certain kinds of difficulties or certain kinds of discriminations. But within that category, there are other kinds of categories which influence the experience. So a poor woman will have a very, very different kind of a life from a woman who comes from an economically well-to-do family. Or a woman who comes from a developing nation may have different issues and challenges from a woman who comes from the developed West. So this concept of intersectionality basically refers to the way in which different kinds of inequalities come together and impact the life experiences of persons. So vulnerable populations in a society, for instance, persons with disabilities, are already marginalized, as you know. They are already suffering from a lot of discriminations. But when these identities or when the identity of disability coincides with other identities like gender, caste, class, and so on, the extent or the nature of the marginalization or the discrimination also changes and in many cases becomes worse. So, for instance, if we look at the intersection between disability and gender, we find that disability and gender discrimination are closely interlinked. So let's try and understand what we mean by gender. So gender refers to the kinds of roles and kinds of expectations or the kind of social construction of the way girls and boys, men and women are expected to behave. So normally we think of gender in terms of a binary, that is male or female. But there are also third gendered persons. There are also persons who don't fit into this binary of men and women. And they also experience different kinds of discriminations, which we will talk about in a little while. The important thing that we have to bear in mind is that in a patriarchal society, being a woman is already considered as a lesser status. So, for instance, we see this in the preference for male children. Why is it that when a child is born, there is a lot of anxiety about whether it is a male child or a female child? So, in a patriarchal society, we know that there is a what we call a son preference. There is a preference for male children. And that women are actually seen as really not belonging to the family in which they are born. So, this continued kind of desire for a male child is something that is very much a part of the patriarchal system. Now, what happens if a woman or a girl is either born with disability or becomes disabled later in her life? She faces an even more adverse situation. Firstly, she is female and therefore she does not have the same status as a male. And on top of it, if she happens to be a girl or a woman with a disability, it becomes even more difficult or even more discriminatory for her to live in the society. So as we know, in many cultures and societies, women are expected to be the homemakers and to look after the domestic space only. So what are the major roles that are conceptualized for women, either as a mother, a wife, somebody who will help out with the house, somebody who will help out with the domestic work? And the entire responsibility of the domestic space is often placed on the woman herself. The political, social, religious, and other kinds of power would often be in the hands of the men in patriarchal societies. So the economy, the important structures of society, the decision-making is frequently controlled by males in a patriarchal setup. So we have in earlier sessions spoken about the word ableism also, in which a person who is disabled is considered inferior to a person who is able. So when you have these two systems of patriarchy, in which women are considered as inferior, and ableism, in which persons with disability are considered inferior, when these two systems coincide, we find that the lives of women with disabilities, therefore, becomes much harder than that of non-disabled women. So, for instance, the presence of a girl child in the family may be viewed as a curse or a punishment by the family. She may be considered as a lifelong burden. She may be considered unfit to carry out the domestic duties or to take care of the family. And therefore, she may often be restricted to the four walls of the house and not really allowed to participate in social activities in the community. The accepted gender roles which are available for women may not be available for her. For instance, marriage. So very often a girl with disability, her appearance or her physical appearance may not go against the traditional expectation of beauty or fitness, and therefore she may not be regarded as suitable for marriage and motherhood. And she is usually, the victim of stigma and rejection. Also, a woman with disability who may need care, long-term caregiving herself, may be considered to be incapable of caring for other people. So these are some of the stereotypes that exist with regard to girls and women with disabilities. Now, if we look at the situation of women with disabilities, we find that they are frequently denied adequate nutrition, health care, educational opportunities, employment opportunities. Violence is something that they face on a very, very pervasive basis, whether it is physical, verbal, or sexual violence. They are often subjected to domestic violence, the dependence and isolation that they experience. They are frequently sent to institutions or hospitals. They may be, placed there against their will. So violence is an unfortunate reality in the lives of many women and girls who experience disability. Let's talk now about another very, very important intersecting identity, and that is caste. So when we speak of the intersections of disability and caste, we find that those who actually come under the category of the lower castes or the Dalits or the SCs and STs, these communities actually experience a good deal of social discrimination and oppression. Because the caste system itself is a system of social stratification and hierarchy which is based on birth. So your birth determines where in the social system you fit, what is your position in the social system. Now, those who are at the bottom of the hierarchy or who are at the bottom of the ladder, they face exclusion and discrimination, and this has been a historical reality in our society. Now, studies have found that SC and ST populations have a much higher prevalence of disability. Now, the reason is that they experience a high level of poverty. And as we have discussed many times in previous programs also, poverty and disability are very closely interlinked. We often find that those who come from these communities may also have certain occupations which are hazardous. So, for instance, leather tanning, manual scavenging, which are occupations that have been assigned to Dalits for centuries. These are extremely hazardous occupations and can result in persons being injured, being badly, or experiencing disability. They may experience lack of access to proper nutrition, sanitation, and unsafe work environments, as we have mentioned, and also the social deprivation that they experience. In other words, their lack of access to education, or, being incorporated in the skilled workforce, lack of access to benefits and entitlements, low rates of primary, secondary, and higher education, all these contribute to their social deprivation. Also, certain cultural and religious beliefs, for instance, the notion of karma or punishment for past sins, is something which is a very deeply embedded notion with regard to disability in our cultural context. Now, when we look at the intersections of caste, gender, and disability together, we see that Dalit women with disability face multiple levels of oppression. So being Dalit, being a woman, and being disabled. Similarly, transgender or third gender persons with disabilities also would be very likely facing a good deal of hardships. However, there is very little research on these categories of individuals, which is much needed for us to understand their conditions better. Now, another very important area of intersectionality is class, that is the socio-economic class. What is your socio-economic position? Now, as we have repeated on multiple programs, disability and poverty are very closely related in a bidirectional manner. So what we mean by this is that persons with disabilities have a higher risk of becoming poor, they have lower levels of access to healthcare, education, employment, and social participation. And persons who are poor are more likely to be disabled. For instance, they may lack access to preventive health services. They may experience malnutrition or undernutrition and live in risky living conditions which can predispose them or which can make them vulnerable to becoming disabled either on a temporary or on a permanent basis. Now, what about religion? What about religious identity? Now, this is interesting because we see that the way in which religion plays a role in shaping Indian society through history is very, very important. So, religion is a very, very important social phenomenon in our society and plays a major role in determining how disability is understood and how persons with disabilities are treated. So across religious beliefs, you may have very interesting kinds of beliefs about how disability may be seen as a punishment for sins. We've mentioned, the notion of karma. But at the same time, we also find that concepts such as service of the weak, the vulnerable, compassion and care, everyone being entitled to having the same respect or being equal in the eyes of the Almighty. These are also some of the religious beliefs and cultural practices that are prevalent in the community. Now, the reason why an intersectional approach or intersectionality is so important is because all these intersecting factors play a role in making us understand how a person experiences their disability. And understanding these diverse experiences is important for policymakers to design more effective programs and schemes. Now let's talk a little bit about Unit 13, which is pertaining to access to education and health. Now, Unit 13 also follows from some of the important points that are made in Unit 12, which speaks about the intersectionality of disability with other categories of identity. Now, as you know, learners, education and health are essential for the development of all individuals and for citizens to lead a good quality life. Healthy and educated citizens are the foundations of a healthy and prosperous nation. Now, the right to education is a fundamental right in India, and every child, whether disabled or non-disabled, is entitled to receive an appropriate education. Some of the important laws and policies that pertain to education include the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Amendment Act of 2012, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, the National Education Policy of 2020, which is a very, very important policy which is really has made a huge contribution towards changing the way in which education in India is conceptualized and will be delivered in the years to come. So the NEP 2020 speaks of a category called the Socio-Economic Disadvantaged Groups, or the SEDGs, and this also includes children and students with disabilities. So there is a good deal of emphasis on inclusive education of these underprivileged groups, including students with disabilities, in the National Education Policy. Let's now try and understand what are some of the barriers to education of children with disabilities. We find that children with disabilities are very much disadvantaged when it comes to accessing education, whether at the school level or at the higher education level. And some of the issues or some of the reasons behind this are what we will quickly go through. Now, very important is the perception of parents. Now, in a family, when there is a child with disability, and given the kind of negative stereotypes that exist about disability, parents may think that the child is incapable of learning. The child is not really ready to go to school. They may wonder what use is it to send the child to school. So the perception of parents is very often critical in whether or not a child will receive an education. We also find gender discrimination, which we've earlier discussed. We've spoken about the intersectionality of gender and disability. So girl children with disabilities are considered even more marginalized, and they may be considered really a burden, and therefore parents may not make the effort to send them to school or to give them appropriate skills and an education that can help them to move ahead with their lives. And once again, related to this is the concept of social stigma, that disability is considered as a negative or an inferior identity, and a lack of understanding about disability. So there are many kinds of disabilities, there are physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, but there tend to be many, many myths and misconceptions about these disabilities. So for instance, it is thought that children who may have learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities may not be able to study at all. They may not be able to benefit at all from school. Whereas the reality is that if they are exposed to education, if they are exposed to the correct kind or an appropriate way of teaching them, they also can learn just as well as other children who may not have those kinds of disabilities. So this kind of lack of understanding about the capabilities, the capacities, and the abilities of children with different kinds of disabilities is also a very, very important barrier. Now, poverty, which we keep discussing over and over again, but it is very, very important. It is a very, very major factor which limits or, hinders access of a child to an education. Let's talk a bit about schools and teachers. Now, this is very, very important because when we speak about going to school, what are the things that come in mind? The kind of school that the child is going to and the kind of teaching or training that the child is going to receive over there. We find that in many schools, there is a lack of trained teachers who are able to understand the needs of children with disabilities, who are trained in addressing different kinds of disabilities. We often find that the school building may be inaccessible. There may not be facilities that a child with disability may need. For instance, there may not be braille for a child who has got a visual disability. There may not be many of the facilities that would really help a child with disability to flourish and do well in a school. And this lack of awareness also is a very, very critical feature. So as we've mentioned, it may be thought that the child may just go to school and be incapable of learning. But this is absolutely not the case. With the correct amount of inclusion, with the correct tools and techniques of teaching, with adequate training of teachers, and with proper accessible infrastructure, children with disabilities can learn just as well as children who may not have disabilities. Also, there is a lack of linkages between different departments. So, for instance, the departments that deal with the education and training of children with disabilities and the other departments may not really be in proper communication with each other. So this may lead to a good deal of confusion about what is the appropriate school the child should go to, what kind of educational system the child should receive, and so on. And in this context, it's also important to note that we have different kinds of schools for children with disabilities. So there are the special schools which accept children only with disabilities. Then you have certain schools in which there is a mix of children with disabilities and non-disabled children. However, you will find that in these schools, the teachers for the children with disabilities may teach them in a different classroom or administer a different curriculum. Whereas the research in education tells us that the best environment for children with disabilities is an inclusive setting where not only can they learn with other children, but other children also can learn about how persons with disabilities also have capacities and abilities. So in this way, both kinds of children, disabled and non-disabled, can mutually benefit from each other's company and each other's co-learning. Now, when school education is such an issue or such a challenge, needless to say that higher education is also a very, very major issue in which persons with disabilities get left out. So the very sobering figure from the All India Survey on Higher Education, the data from 2017-2018 to 2021-22 indicates that the enrollment of students with disabilities in higher education is between 0.19 to 0.22% of the total students enrolled in the higher education system. Now, this is indeed a very, troubling kind of a statistic, because higher education is crucial for individuals to receive proper training and to prepare them in future for the job market. So what are some of the reasons for this? Pretty much the similar reasons to the reasons that we had outlined for school education. These reasons can include lack of awareness on the part of both parents, educators, as well as the students themselves about what are the opportunities available in higher education. There may be various laws and policies, however, lack of proper implementation of these policies. Lack of disability-friendly facilities. So when a child or a person with disability goes to college, they may find that the facilities are really not conducive for them in terms of their accessibility, in terms of infrastructure, and so on. And also a lack of trained personnel. Now we find that at the school level, school teachers are given a lot of training in how to deal with how to teach children with disabilities and other children in the classroom. But what happens in higher education? Teachers in higher education really do not receive any formal training on the methods and the strategies or the kind of classroom techniques they need to adopt with persons with disabilities in the higher education sector. So this is a major limiting factor. And so therefore, children who may still have found school to be a congenial experience may go to college and find it very intimidating, very alienating. They may not at all feel comfortable. They may not feel seen. They may not feel understood. So higher education can be extremely alienating for persons with disabilities if there is no proper infrastructure, if there is a lack of sensitization, and very often the attitudinal barriers and stereotypes that we see in higher education are very pervasive. So, for instance, it is assumed that a person with disability in higher education is really not somebody who is going to succeed, or they're not going to do well in the job market, and so on. So these deeply entrenched attitudes are very, very strongly present and need to be challenged. Now, how do we deal with this? What are some of the strategies with which we can promote access and inclusion in the educational system? So promoting inclusive practices in schools and colleges is key, because inclusion is beneficial for all learners. So when we have a variety of students, different kinds of students from different socio-economic backgrounds, students with different abilities or disabilities, when we have this kind of a group in the class, we find that each of them not only learns from each other, but those accommodations and adjustments which are made for persons with disabilities benefit the entire class. So teachers will then adopt strategies which will help not just the children with disabilities, but also all children in the classroom. So inclusion is a very, very important goal that has to be attempted, or that has to be worked very, very steadily towards. An important issue is including disability-related issues in the curricula. Now, this particular course that we are doing, this is one of the examples of how we are including awareness, knowledge, and information about disability in the curriculum. Similarly, it is very, very important right from the school level to be aware about the issues of individuals with disabilities and how inclusion for all kinds of people, able and disabled, is very, very important to have a civilized society. Ensuring accessibility, this is also crucial, because accessibility is not just for children who are, or students who have disability. Accessible classrooms, accessible teaching learning materials, accessible examinations, accessible facilities will help or benefit all categories of students. Financial assistance and support is also very important, and this is something which is key, because students with disabilities may suffer from a lot of economic disadvantages. They may come from poor homes, and therefore to enable them to avail of education both at the school level as well as at the higher education level requires financial access. And it is seen that the government has put in place many schemes and policies. Many scholarships are available for persons with disabilities. But once again, there is a lack of awareness on the part of parents, on the part of teachers, on how these facilities can be provided to persons with disabilities. So learners, this is where we will end this part of the presentation, and we will be back to discuss the remaining themes in the block. Thank you.
Or radio journalism or online journalism? Or do you want to learn with the flexibility of open learning? Or if you are a working professional, wants to enhance your knowledge and skill with certification in the field of electronic media, then School of Journalism and New Media Study, IGNOU, offers PG Diploma in Electronic Media for you. This program includes audio and audio-visual program production for radio, television and online platforms. Here are some important details about the program. We have total 8 courses of 32 credits, 6 theory courses, 1 practical and 1 project. Eligibility: bachelor's degree in any subject. Minimum duration 1 year, maximum 3 years. Medium is English, but students can write their examinations, assignments, practical and project in Hindi also. So if you are interested in television, radio or online media, please come and join IGNOU's PG Diploma in Electronic Media.
Hello learners, and welcome back to the second part of this particular program in which we are discussing Block 4 of the course BMDG 171, in which we are discussing the socio-economic realities experienced by persons with disabilities. We just concluded the previous part by talking about access to education for persons with disabilities. Now, to continue the Unit 13 from which this particular portion was taken, we will move to the next important domain, which is access to health. So, as you know, access to health is one of the crucial indicators for the development of a nation. So, healthy citizens make a healthy nation. And an important concept here is that of health equity. Now, this means that every person has equal opportunity to remain in the best health possible, and that nobody is at a disadvantage because of their income, social position, location, or other circumstances to get the best healthcare available. Now, this is a very, very important concept that we have to keep in mind, because health equity means that no matter how rich, how poor, how old, how young, male, female, whatever caste, whatever class you belong to, everybody has the right to optimum healthcare facilities to maintain their health and to be in the best possible health. Now, Persons with disabilities experience many health inequities. In other words, they are really not able to access healthcare, adequate healthcare that can help them to maintain themselves. Now, because of their disability, we find that persons with disabilities actually are major users of the healthcare systems. They may require to visit the doctor very often. They may require rehabilitation services. They may require medical facilities. They may require aids and appliances. So their health needs are quite significant. And therefore, it is very, very important to ensure that access to health for persons with disabilities is of the best possible kind and that it is freely available. So we find that discrimination, poverty, exclusion from education and employment, and barriers in the health system itself lead to persons with disabilities experience many kinds of health inequities. Now, according to the World Health Organization, these are some very, very interesting figures. An estimated 1.3 billion people globally experience significant disability. This is about 16% of the world's population, or 1 in 6 of us experience some form of disability. Now, some persons with disabilities, according to the WHO, die up to 20 years earlier than those without disabilities. And persons with disabilities have 2 times the risk of developing conditions such as depression, asthma, diabetes, stroke, obesity, or poor oral health. Now, these are indeed extremely sobering figures that make us to pause and think about the kind of healthcare and the kind of health access that needs to be provided to persons with disabilities. To continue to quote the WHO, there are higher rates of premature mortality. In other words, persons with disabilities may die at an earlier age. They may experience higher rates of comorbid health conditions. Now, by comorbid health conditions, we mean diseases or conditions existing side by side. So, there may be a particular kind of a disability, but along with that disability, there may be other diseases or other conditions which exist side by side. And persons with disabilities are vulnerable to having comorbid conditions. They may experience higher incidence of diseases such as tuberculosis, diabetes, stroke, sexually transmitted infections, and heart problems. They also have an increased risk for developing mental health conditions such as depression or anxiety as compared to individuals without disabilities. This is as per the World Health Organization. And all these facts and figures are things which really need our serious consideration and attention. What are some of the barriers that exist that inhibit persons with disability from having health access? So these are very similar to the barriers that we mentioned with regard to education. So poverty and financial burden. Now, many persons with disabilities require a high level of care and they require quite a lot of expenditure to maintain their day-to-day lives, whether it is persons to care for them, so paid caregivers, or medications, treatments and therapies, aids and appliances. All these cost money. So there is a fairly substantial financial burden on the family when there is a person with disability. And without these aids and appliances, medications, etc., their health condition can actually deteriorate. So these are very, very essential for their maintenance and survival. We find that poor living conditions also are a major factor or a major barrier to health access. So persons who may be living in extremely poor or deprived neighborhoods, they may not be having adequate water, sanitation, and other facilities. We may find that toilet facilities are poor. So, for instance, a person with locomotor disability may find it very difficult to use the washroom. So often we find that in Indian context, we have the floor pan. So a person who is not able to walk properly, it frequently has to crawl to the washroom and may pick up various kinds of infections. So these poor living conditions are a crucial factor in creating barriers to health access. Lack of education and employment. So when a person with disability does not have a proper education or training, they are not, in proper employment, they are not earning, they are financially dependent. This kind of cycle of poverty may in fact lead to further health conditions. They may not be able to afford treatment. They may not be able to go to the doctor or the hospital when they need to. So it is a kind of a vicious cycle in which poverty leads to lack of education and employment. Lack of education and employment leads to poor health. Poor health also then leads to further poverty. So this vicious cycle is something that is very much prevalent and is something that needs to be thought about and looked at very carefully. There are also multiple intersecting factors. Now, in the previous session, we spoke about the intersectionality between disability and other kinds of identity. So here, for instance, if we look at women with disabilities, they may find it very, very difficult to access proper reproductive or sexual health. They may find it very embarrassing to go to a doctor. They may not be able to speak openly about their issues and challenges. Many women with disabilities, as we've mentioned, experience extremely dehumanizing conditions or also experience violence, which can further lead to ill health. So they find themselves extremely inhibited in actually communicating their health-related problems, and therefore this may lead to delays in getting the kind of treatment and the kind of care that they need. And also because of the position of women with disabilities who are seen as being a burden very often in the family, families may not actually be actively, proactive in taking care of their women and girl children with disabilities. Lack of infrastructure and services. Now, this is a very, very important dimension which we need to think about. So think about your own day-to-day life. If you visit a major hospital, if you visit a public hospital, you may find that there are many facilities which are available, but then there are also many facilities which may not be available or may be in a poor condition. Now, persons with disabilities have to negotiate many barriers within the hospital system. One of the important barriers that they also have to face is that health providers can sometimes be extremely insensitive and unsympathetic or unempathetic to persons with disabilities. So they may not actually listen to them. They may not try to actually get the details about what it is that they are going through. They may treat them in a very, very casual or in a very, very abrupt manner. So this kind of lack of access to good services is a major inhibiting factor for persons with disabilities. Also, factors like transport. To get to the hospital, to get to the clinic, you need accessible transport. You need accessible buildings. You need accessible waiting areas where persons with disabilities can be accommodated. Children with disabilities may face a lot of difficulties in hospital situations. So, for instance, children with autism or other kinds of developmental disabilities who may have to wait for a very long period in a hospital situation, they may find waiting very, very difficult, and this may lead to a lot of behavioral issues and challenges. Then this may further, create the stigma and the rejection around them. Parents themselves may then be reluctant to take the child to a hospital or to see the doctor. So these are some of the very, very important factors with regard to lack of infrastructure and services. One of the important factors that is increasingly being discussed in the contemporary times is the climate impact. So you may all have heard of climate change as one of the very major issues and challenges that the whole world is facing: global warming and climate change due to environmental degradation. Now, climate change adversely affects persons with disabilities. So when there is climate change, when there are floods, when there are unexpected climatic events, persons with disabilities find it even harder then to access services and facilities. So climate impact is one of the important factors that we also need to think about. Now, how can we think about promoting access to healthcare services? So firstly, there need to be laws and policies in place which will address specifically the issues and challenges of persons with disabilities. Coverage and quality of healthcare services needs to be improved. So healthcare services basically need to be consciously tailored or consciously structured in a way that they address the issues and challenges of persons with disabilities. Health promotion must be encouraged. So what are the different ways in which persons with disabilities can maintain their health? What are the healthy habits? What are the healthy diets that they need to take? Health promotion is important in helping them to maintain their health and not becoming vulnerable to other diseases and conditions. Early identification of children with disabilities. So the earlier a child with disability is identified or diagnosed, the sooner the treatment, the rehabilitation, the education, the training can begin. Very often in families, there is a tendency to not really address the difficulties that a child may be facing. Very often families refuse to see what is quite clearly in front of them, that the child is not developing in a typical manner or the manner in which he or she should be developing. And they just do not take the child to a proper doctor or a trained therapist so that they can understand the problem. So this kind of stigma regarding disability is really what prevents families from taking their children for health checkups or for getting their conditions diagnosed or identified. Health insurance and financial assistance. This is also a very, very important factor. It is seen that many insurance companies do not give health insurance to persons who have pre-existing disabilities. And this is something that really, creates a major barrier or an obstacle in persons with disabilities from being able to obtain health care. Improving rehabilitation services, for instance, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and all the other various rehabilitation services that are available, these need to be made available. These need to be available in all parts of the country, not just in selected urban centers, in order that persons with disabilities may access them quite easily and comfortably. And also, all these services need to be well monitored. So there needs to be a proper system of monitoring, of ensuring that those who need care, those who need specific kinds of care, can get that care and how that care is given to them. What are the ways in which their care plan or their rehabilitation or their therapy is administered and they benefit from it. So these are some of the important factors in promoting access to healthcare services for persons with disabilities. And now let's go to Unit 14, which refers to political and economic exclusion and opportunities. Now, there is a common belief that persons with disabilities are completely dependent on their families. They lack the capability to participate in the political and economic activities of the society and nation. How many politicians or how many world leaders with disabilities have we really seen? There is a lack of persons with disabilities in the public space, and this is because they have really not been given adequate opportunities to assume leadership roles. You may have heard of the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a wheelchair user and he was the President of the United States during the time of World War II. But there are very few world leaders, global leaders with disabilities who we all know about or talk about. So this is something that we really need to think about. So persons with disabilities may also be considered as an economic burden on their families, as we've discussed earlier, incapable of earning and contributing to the family. And this is particularly the case with persons with disabilities like intellectual disabilities, mental health conditions, autism, and so on. So it may be thought that these persons are really incapable of leading the kind of life, leading a normal life, a so-called normal life, or leading a life in which they can look after themselves, look after their families, be productive, have an income, and so on and so forth. Now, what are some of the barriers to political participation for persons with disabilities? We've mentioned how few, disabled politicians or politicians with disabilities or, world leaders with disabilities we really get to see. Now, once again, we have to speak about these societal attitudes. Now, persons with disabilities are seen as an invisible minority. They are not given adequate representations in elections or in leadership positions. There are also practical barriers, for instance, lack of transportation to public meetings, registration centers, public offices and polling stations in the case of voting, and inaccessible public spaces. Now, at the heart of political participation is participating in the voting process. And we find that there is a lack of understanding of different types of disabilities. It is thought that persons who may have intellectual disabilities really don't need to vote, that they are not capable of making a correct decision, or they are not capable of deciding for themselves. Now, this is completely a myth. Persons with all kinds of disabilities are citizens. They have citizenship rights, and therefore they are completely entitled, just like anybody else, to participate in the political life of the nation, to participate in our nation's democracy, and to participate in electing their leaders. When we look at the economic participation of persons with disabilities, we find that when it comes to work, they are often assigned either unpaid or poorly paid work. So it is thought that the kinds of jobs that persons with disabilities can do is basically low-skilled jobs, menial jobs, repetitive jobs, jobs that don't really require much skill, much training, and so on. A lot of persons with disabilities, particularly in the rural areas, may be engaged in farm work. They may be engaged in helping in the family to look after the family work or family-based occupations. So it is not that persons with disabilities don't work. They do work. In many cases, they have to work for their livelihood. But the nature of the work that they are assigned, or the nature of the work in which they engage in, is often extremely of a very poor quality, of either paid or unpaid, either poorly paid or unpaid, often very unsafe. And very importantly, there is often a lack of job security. So we use the term precarity. By precarity, we mean that their conditions are precarious. They may have a job today, they may be thrown out of the job tomorrow. So the permanency of their livelihood or their employment is a major challenge. Now, as we've mentioned, many persons with disabilities, a large number of persons with disabilities, live and work in the rural areas. And therefore, a lot of them are employed in the unorganized sector. Now, the unorganized sector is the sector which basically comprises of jobs which really don't come under any kind of a legal system, and jobs which are unregulated really by law and policy. So this is what we mean by the unorganized sector. So the unorganized sector is actually one of the major employers of persons with disabilities, and therefore you find that persons with disabilities may be engaged in family-based work and the unorganized sector, as I have mentioned. Now, what are some of the other areas in which they may be engaged in? They may be engaged, for instance, in organized sector professions also, or in higher status professions, but we find that even here they may be subjected to prejudices and inaccessible workplaces. Women with disabilities, persons from the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities, we find often experience greater discrimination. And also, as we've mentioned, the special challenges of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and psychosocial disabilities are very, very important to consider and to think about, because they may frequently be considered as unproductive, they may be considered as economic burdens. So this is an important area that we need to think about. To continue our discussion on the economic participation of persons with disabilities, how do we actually promote their participation? Now, we find that in many cases, persons with disabilities find it very, very difficult to be a part of job trainings, vocational education, and this is a challenge that needs to be adequately addressed. So the kinds of trainings, the kinds of, job readiness packages or, programs that need to be prepared for persons with disabilities needs to be thought about carefully. We find that skill development is a very, very major focus in the current times. How do we encourage persons with disabilities to be skilled or to obtain skills in different areas? So skilling and training them for specific job roles is one of the very, very important initiatives that needs to be taken up and in fact is being taken up. So for persons with disabilities, specific kinds of employment readiness programs, soft skills trainings, and so on are extremely important in making them job ready and enabling them to participate in the job market. Now let's talk about how participation of persons with disabilities can be promoted in both the political as well as the economic realms. Let's start by talking about the political arena. So it is very, very important to change public attitudes towards the political rights and entitlements as well as the economic capabilities of persons with disabilities. Now, you may have heard this mantra of the Election Commission, no voter to be left behind. So no voter with disability should also be left behind. And it is very, very encouraging and heartening that in India, in the elections that were recently held, there was a special kind of initiative and special efforts were taken to ensure that persons with disabilities were also able to cast their votes. So accessible voting booths, provision of assistance to disabled voters. So there was also a provision that if a voter who has disability needs a caregiver or needs a family member to accompany them in the booth, this provision was made. Normally, as you know, a voter has to enter the booth alone, cast their ballot and then leave. But in cases of persons with disabilities, this provision was also made in case they needed support or they needed an escort to go with them into the voting booth to cast their vote. And this is very, very important because unless persons with disabilities participate in the democratic process, their rights and entitlements will really not find a place in the public consciousness. Making persons with disabilities aware of their rights and entitlements and what are the laws and the policies that are in place for them. India has one of the most progressive legislations with regard to disabilities, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016. This is a rights-based act which gives equal rights, equal citizenship rights in all domains of social and public and personal life to persons with disabilities. But how many persons with disabilities are actually aware of this law, are aware of the provisions, are aware of what it is that they are legally entitled to? So not only must good laws, good inclusive, human rights-based laws be made, but also these laws need to be disseminated. Awareness about these laws, knowledge about these laws also needs to be made widely available to persons with disabilities, to their families, their teachers, their employers, and society at large. And it is very important that persons with disabilities themselves are directly involved in formulating the policies that concern them. So, including them, making them members of various policy-making bodies, listening to their voices, listening to their concerns, this is crucial in order to promote their participation in decision-making, promote their participation in being part and parcel of the everyday life of society. With regard to employment, a very important concept that the International Labour Organization spoke of is decent work. Now, what is decent work? Decent work basically involves work opportunities that are productive, that pay well, that provide workplace security and support for the family, and give the individual opportunities for personal and professional growth, social inclusion. They enable the individual to raise their concerns at the workplace, participation in decision-making, and also gender equality. So this definition or this kind of, defining of what actually constitutes decent work is very, very important. And persons with disabilities need inclusive employment and decent work. So an effort needs to be made to ensure that they are not exploited at workplaces because of their disabilities, that they are not made to work more hours or lesser pay. So basically there needs to be equality and parity and equality of opportunity at the workplace. Interestingly, the ILO estimates that economies can see a 3 to 7% growth if they create opportunities for persons with disabilities. Now, this is very important. So, employing persons with disabilities is not something to be done for charity. It is something to be done so that the economy can grow, because persons with disabilities have a great deal to contribute. They have many untapped abilities, talents, and capacities that need to be taken note of and need to be used in order that the economic life of the country may improve and the economy can grow. There is also a need, like we've mentioned repeatedly, for accessibility. So accessible workplaces, public infrastructure, such as transport, roads, footpaths, public buildings, and public information. How can they obtain information in accessible formats? How can technology and information technology be used to ensure that they are able to access information that concerns them, or information relating to jobs, information relating to different kinds of opportunities? And disability awareness. Now, this really lies at the heart of the matter. Understanding the capabilities of persons with different kinds of disabilities is crucial. There is also a need for better policies for employees to return to work after having acquired a disability. So very often you find if a person is injured or disabled at the workplace, they may in fact lose their jobs, whereas in fact they should be all efforts should be made to bring them back to work. And the workplace needs to make the necessary accommodations in order to enable them to perform their duties, or also it can reassign them duties which they will be able to perform having experienced a disabling condition. Intersectoral collaboration. Now, what do we mean by this? It means that the different sectors of society and economy, for instance, health, education, the corporate sector, information technology, architecture, legal services, all these sectors need to come together and work in a collaborative manner for disability inclusion. So to sum up, dear learners, what we've been speaking about, persons with disabilities face several barriers to their political and economic participation. These include negative attitudes, architectural and infrastructure barriers, lack of awareness about disability. There is a widespread belief that persons with disabilities are complete dependents and not entitled to political rights and economic opportunities, a belief that must be challenged and must be overturned. So educating the public about disability and disability rights and standards of inclusivity is crucial. This is the need of the hour. And lastly, persons with disabilities must be involved in formulating the policies that affect them. With this, we come to the end of this session. I do hope it was enlightening for you, and I do hope that inclusion becomes a part and parcel of your day-to-day lives. Thank you.